Hi, I'm Stewart Bailey, the curator at Wings Over the Rockies Air and Space Museum, and on this episode we are going to go behind the wings of the first U.S. Air Force fighter to fly supersonic and level flight, the North American F-100 Super Sabre. A Cold War icon, this jet helped usher in the age of supersonic air combat and played a pivotal role in the skies over Vietnam. We'll explore the aircraft's history and take an up-close look at its special design features. And to make this episode even better, we have got an F-100 Super Sabre pilot here to tell his stories.
One night we take off, it's pitch black, raining, and suddenly you see the flare on the ground, drop your bombs, pull off, go back. It's dangerous. You had a spirit of, we're going to do anything for our troops on the ground. It saved my life.
This one is going to be cool. It's time to go behind the wings. It was called the Hun. And as the first of the Century Series fighters, the F-100 Super Sabre gave the U.S. Air Force its first supersonic combat aircraft. In fact, it broke the sound barrier on its very first test flight. Providing air cover as well as close air support, the Super Sabre scored the Air Force's first air-to-air victory in the war when F-100s shot down 3 North Vietnamese MiG-17s during a strike on the Than Hoa Bridge in 1965. The Huns would go on to operate as fast forward air control aircraft and as wild weasels, using missiles that would home in on radar signals to take out enemy surface-to-air missile sites. After the war, Super Sabres went on to equip the Air National Guard squadrons in over half of the 50 U.S. states. The Super Sabre also had a starring role on the airshow stage as the mount of the U.S. Air Force's Thunderbirds aerial demonstration team. The team operated the F-100 for a total of 13 years and thrilled airshow audiences all over North America and overseas. After their retirement in the U.S. in 1979, a large number of F-100s were converted to pilotless drones and expended as targets for air-to-air missile testing. As the U.S. Air Force's first supersonic fighter, the F-100 Super Sabre initiated a new age of high-speed aviation, and it left a lasting legacy as one of the premier fighters of the Cold War. Now that we've learned a little bit about the F-100's history, let's talk with a Super Sabre pilot, John Warman Stewart. Thank you for coming to do this. We got a lot to talk about.
Yep.
So let's get to it. Wanted to start off just by asking you about your initial experience with the F-100.
I went to high school on a military base where they had F-100s. So when I was 15, 16, 17 years old, I started to see them. Fast forward, I graduated from college in 1966. I was number 1 on the draft list. I joined the Air Force. I went to pilot training. You put down your choices, and my first choice was F-100, and that's what I got. The Air Force taught me to fly, and then I spent 6 months learning to fly the F-100 at Luke Air Base, and then went straight to Vietnam.
For the folks who don't know anything about the F-100, what would you tell them about it?
It came about because after the Korean War, when we first saw MiG-15s flying with the F-86, which had a good record as an air superiority, we said, what's next if the Soviets come up with something else? North American aviation had already looked at an advanced version, really, of the F-86, which they called the F-100. They started off calling it F-45 because the wings were swept 45 degrees. It was very new technology, and quite frankly, by today's standards, you would call it a dangerous airplane. It had characteristics that we didn't know anything about until we found out, and often we found out through an accident. There was so much that was not known about the characteristics of flying a swept-wing airplane. It wasn't done in a simulator. It wasn't done on a drafting table. They built the airplane, we think it'll do this, let's go fly it and see what happens. My first impression was that this was a first-line fighter. I'm right straight out of pilot training. Oh my gosh, what a thrill to get in this airplane.
What was it like to solo in this?
So I first flew in a 2-seat. We flew maybe 5 or 6 missions to learn how to take off and land and fly it. And then you hopped in this airplane all by yourself. And I can remember, just as it happened right now, it was thrilling. It was the first time that I've flown an airplane where no one else could be in it.
When was the first time you took one supersonic?
Before we soloed it in the two-seater, the only way you knew that you were supersonic is the Mach meter went over 0.1. It was absolutely smooth, and that showed how much they had advanced in aircraft design in a very short period of time. From the first time that Bell 1, the rocket ship, went supersonic to this airplane was only a few years.
In flying the Super Sabre, what was some of the biggest challenges?
The first day that I walked into a classroom at Luke Air Force Base, they sat us down in a room with a screen, and the very first thing they showed us was a Sabre dance, and then they started telling us why that happened and what we needed to do. They had us slow down and fly it and show you what happens if you get slow and you put the aileron in, the airplane goes the opposite direction. I remember one time in air-to-air, and I pulled back on the stick and pushed the rudder in, and I did a roll like that. I started at 450 knots. At the end of the roll, I was at 250 knots. And so those are the ways that you learn the characteristics of it.
Right out of training and so on, after about 100 hours or so that you were sent off to Vietnam. What was it like taking it into combat?
You self-examine yourself a lot. That's the first time that we actually dropped live bombs. They were very much aware that you were a young person that frankly knew nothing. They'd tell you what to do, and particularly they'd tell you what not to do.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about the missions you flew?
I flew 277 missions from an air base called Benoit, north of Saigon. We flew close air support, but the biggest challenge was weather. So we would take off, and we had no navigation equipment except what's called a TACAN, and then we would fly in any weather, any conditions, day or night. And I'll give you an example. One night, I'm on alert pad, we take off, it's pitch black, there's thunderstorms all over the place. We fly 100 miles from the field, we let down through the clouds, we're talking to the FAC, but we can't see him. That means forward air controller. We break out with about a 1,500 foot ceiling, 3 miles visibility, pitch black, raining. And he drops a flare on the ground, we find it, and we're basically flying instruments around a pattern, and when you roll out on final, you come out and you don't see anything until you get about 3 miles out, and suddenly you see the flare on the ground, drop your bombs, pull off, go back. It's dangerous. But it was very challenging. You had a spirit of, we're going to do anything for our troops on the ground.
The troops on the ground really appreciated it. Let's talk a little bit too about the maintenance of the aircraft.
You look at the pilots and you think of them as these great heroes, but the real heroes were the people on the ground that provided the support for the airplane, that made it ready to go, so when you hopped in, you could go do your job. When we would land the airplane, for each 1 hour flying, it would get somewhere between 25 and 30 hours of maintenance on the ground. The hydraulic systems would leak, or you get a rough running engine and they'd come back and they'd take the engine out, which was a huge job. You had to take the whole tail off the airplane. They were not designed for low maintenance. They were designed for whatever they could do. And so there were hundreds of people on the ground that were involved in maintaining it all night long for it to come back the next day.
As the first of the, it was called it the Century Series aircraft, how did it affect the other aircraft that came after it?
So let's call it a giant experiment. The F-100 was the beginning of a series of very advanced aircraft. It laid the groundwork for the next evolution of the Century Series. And at that time, we were building airplanes very rapidly. 3 to 5 years, there'd be a new airplane out there, and each one was using what they learned in the last.
This time period when the F-100 came into being was very much the depth of the Cold War.
When I go to the reunions, I'm in the younger third. These are people that had the patch on their shoulder called Einbahnstraße, which meant one-way street. Their job was to take off, deliver a nuclear weapon, fly to Siberia, and jump out. It took a certain characteristic of people to do that, and so I think the image of what it was like to be a fighter pilot started to expand. In aviation, there's a number of things you need. You need a good airplane, you need good training, and you need luck. I've been living on borrowed time since 1968 because as a young aviator, I made many mistakes, and I was very lucky that the airplane flew me out of them. And that was what the F-100 was for me. in combat.
John, now that we've heard some of your stories here, let's go take a look at the airplane close up and
I'll see what I can remember. Let's look at this machine. What I want to tell you is the most important thing about this airplane. It has one cockpit. It has one engine. When you are in this airplane, everything is up to you. The first time you put that canopy down, it is a feeling that is impossible to describe.
Well, John, let's start out here at the nose. One of the most visible things about this aircraft is the fact that you have this big intake on the front, and unlike fighters that came later that had radar in the nose, you didn't have radar on this aircraft.
The thing about the nose is this airplane from the beginning was built for speed. It wasn't built for looking at stuff, and that big intake feeds a giant engine for the time. Up in the front of the airplane, there's 4 machine guns, 2 on either side, 20 millimeter. You can go for 2 or 4 guns. When you go 4 guns, you're looking about 1,500 rounds a minute. You have about 250, and so typically you squeeze and go squirt, because you get maybe 20 shells out, and you had high explosives or you had armor piercing, depending on the target you were after.
Let's talk a little bit about the engine.
Well, this is one of the very first afterburning, what we call axial flow engines. This is a J57. This thing was a rugged engine. I had one turbine blade break off, and it cut out the next 2 turbine blades, and the engine continued to run for 200 miles, gave me just barely enough power to fly level flight at about 200 to 220 miles an hour, which was very, very slow. And when I landed and looked up the tailpipe, there was molten metal in there. It's a tough engine. It saved my life.
You talked about this being one of the first with the afterburner. What difference did that make?
It makes a lot of difference. This engine, if you pull it at full power before afterburner, it produces about 10,200 pounds of thrust, but the airplane weighs up to 34,000 pounds. When you push it in afterburner, the thrust increases to 16,000 pounds. So now you have about a 50-50% thrust to weight ratio. It was like there was an explosion. It went boom, and the airplane started moving. And without that, you couldn't take off with a full load of weapons. It wouldn't fly. Fuel consumption was extremely high, about 6 times as much as normal fuel consumption.
Let's go take a look at the wings and the hard points and all the armament.
First, I'm going to talk about this Hummer here. This is a 335-gallon fuel tank. There's 2 of them. The airplane holds about just under 1,100 gallons of fuel internally. If you take this airplane with internal fuel, you can fly it for about 45 minutes. That's why they hang these tanks on here. And it has 6 hard points. 2 are used for tanks, 2 are used for weapons. That allowed you to get the airplane up to a maximum takeoff weight of about 3,400 plus pounds. And the airplane took a long runway to take off with that weight, even in afterburner. This that I'm touching, and I don't know if it'll move, these are called slats. And these automatically come out from the airflow as you slow the airplane, and it allows you to fly the airplane slower. They are just run by the airflow. There's no hydraulics. So if you get some sand and grit in here, one doesn't come out, and then the airplane starts having challenging flying conditions. The first version of this, the A model and the C model, which had no 2-seat versions, also had no flaps, which meant your final approach speed was very, very high, 180 to 185 nautical miles per hour. That's faster than a lot of planes fly.
Also, let's talk a little bit about the armament. This thing could carry a lot of different weapons.
So this is what we call a CBU, cluster bomb weapon. And what it does, it has small explosive devices, kind of like hand grenades, that are about the size of an apple. And this bomb comes off and it flies down, and then at some altitude, the mechanism in the bomb explodes and opens it up. Sometimes 200 or 300 of these will cover a large area in the ground, or we would then have what we call general purpose bombs. Typically We would fly in our Vietnam with a fuel tank full and 4 750-pound bombs. And then there was napalm, which we don't use anymore, which was like a fuel tank filled with jellied fuel with explosive in the front. It would hit the ground and put a big sheet of fire over a large area. A whole variety of weapons could be carried. In the bottom of the fuselage, in this model airplane, was the ability to carry a nuclear weapon. And so this airplane had multiple air-to-ground roles. It was designed as air-to-air, but it became a air-to-ground support aircraft.
Well, John, later in its career, the F-100 was also used in the Wild Weasel mission.
In both the Wild Weasel and the Misty Fact, they used F-100Fs. The Wild Weasel ones were modified with a lot of electronic warfare equipment in them. They'd go out in very hostile territory and try to find the missile sites. And they would do it by flying so that they shot at them so they could find them. The attrition was very high, 25%.
You talked earlier about the Super Sabre being one of the first swept-wing aircraft. Let's talk a little bit about that.
When you have the wings swept back and you get to a high, what we call angle of attack, when you put down an aileron, it's like your hand out the car. If you put the hand like that, the hand pulls back. So if you put the aileron down, it wants to pull the wing back. So this aileron goes down, you want to roll that way, but the airplane turns. Now this wing here gets lift, and instead of the airplane rolling to the left, it rolls to the right. And so what do you use? Use that big rudder up there. You push on the rudder, and then the airplane rolls itself. And this wing fence is so at high angle of attack, it keeps it going over the wing like that to create lift.
Now, that's a lot about the wings. Let's go take a look around the backside.
The first version of this had a much smaller tail. The tail was used to keep the airplane flying straight. And if it wanted to yaw, you pushed in the rudder on one side and kept the airplane flying straight. And then you could fly it at slow speed, straight. Every F-100 pilot knows you fly this airplane with rudder at low speed.
One of the other innovative things about this aircraft is that it had an all-flying stabilizer. The whole stabilizer moved.
This stabilizer was very, very important in the development of control of an airplane at high speeds. As you approach supersonic, you'd get a shock wave that would be formed, and the elevator would be behind the shock wave and would lose effectiveness. And so you lost elevator control. And that's why sometimes the early airplanes, when they got really fast, they would start nosing down and you'd pull back the stick, you couldn't do anything. Well, the whole elevator moves up and down. And so if you have a shock wave at the beginning, you move the shock wave, and that made the airplane much more controllable at high speed.
Well, one more thing while we're at the back end is, even though this is not a Navy airplane, it had a tail hook.
Yeah, the tail hook was there for a variety of reasons, for emergencies, and that would draw you to a stop, just like you see on an aircraft carrier. But really, what we liked about this airplane was we had a parachute in the back that we called a drag chute. Because this airplane flew so fast on final, it took a long runway. And if you put on your brakes and use brakes only, you'd burn up the brakes pretty fast. So as soon as you touch down, you'd pull a handle and a big chute will come out, and that starts slowing you down.
Talking about control, let's go take a look at the cockpit where all the controls are. John, now we're up here at the cockpit. Why don't you give us a little idea of the layout on this?
Well, this was my office for quite a bit of time. Most fighter jets follow a certain pattern in where things are in the cockpit, so you can go from one to the other. On the left side over there is a big throttle, and you would push that slowly up, and then there's what we call a detent, it'd stop. And if you pushed harder, it would go across that detent into afterburner. Up front is your gear, so you have your power, your gear, and your flaps. What else? You have all the systems that control your fuel control. So all of that stuff that is essential is on the left side, that you can do almost everything with your left hand. Well, the stick in the middle, one of them is the trim button, the trigger for your guns. It releases the pickle button to release the bombs. And then the other ones control radars and other systems on the airplane. and they're on the stick so that you can be flying the stick in combat and press one or the other. And then you have a lot of different things on this side which has to do with controlling the temperature of the cockpit, which controls your navigation and your talking. And then you have a bank of warning lights, and the light will come on, it'll be orange, and it'll say oil pressure, and you look at your oil pressure gauge and it's down, and you say, okay, I'm in trouble, I got to do something. On the left side of the instrument panel are the gauges that you use to fly the airplane, an attitude indicator, a heading indicator, an altimeter, your airspeed and Mach indicator. All of those are clustered. We call that the six-pack. And then on the other side of the cockpit are all the engine instruments. Down here, fuel flow, how fast is the fuel flowing, and it goes up to 12,000. That's pounds per hour. Turbine outlet temperature, you have RPM, hydraulic pressure, oil pressure. And here is that switch that we call the drag chute. Touch down with your hand on the stick and you reach up and pull the drag chute. Down here in the panel is specialty stuff for the particular nuclear delivery and delivery of other specific weapons. And then of course it's quite important that you strap in, and it's also important that you know how to get out. And these handles down here are the ejection seat, which when you eject, you let go of the stick normally. That's kind of the basic layout, and in almost all fighters you'll find a similar layout. But now with the fly-by-wire, sometimes your stick will be actually just a small stick on the right-hand side, and everything else is clean in front.
This is first generation jet technology. What's it like versus modern jets that you've flown?
In this jet, we did all of our low-level navigation with a paper map, the heading indicator, our airspeed indicator, and our watch. And that way we go a certain distance at a certain heading, at a certain speed, turn to another heading, and we practiced nuclear weapons delivery by flying low-level all over the place. The modern airplanes, you'll have a GPS navigation, so you know exactly where you are. So this was very crude.
John, thanks for the tour of the cockpit. That's a great show of all the Super Sabre had to offer. Just to finish up, what do you think about the legacy of the F-100?
Although there were jets before it, there was never a jet that was flown by so many with so much experience and so much contribution to our national defense, both in Europe and in Southeast Asia. This was completing the transition from the prop planes of World War II to the jet era, and it opened the door for the advancement in the Century series. I look at it as a stepping stone forward. It was certainly for me a stepping stone into 26 years of flying fighters in the Air Force. That's every unit that I ever flew with, every school that I went to. I've met a lot of great people, and I'm very, very lucky.
Well, John Warman Stewart, thank you so much for your insight on the F-100.
It was great. It tested my memory a bit.
We couldn't cover everything in this episode, so if you have questions or comments, please leave them below the video, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Now come to the museum and see this thing, along with all the other Century Series fighters we have on display. Now we've made it to the end of the video, and if you subscribe, thank you. And if you haven't subscribed, well, just do it already. I gotta get back to work.